Okay, we are ready.
Awesome, thank you. Welcome, everybody, to the May 14, 2024 meeting of the Land Use and Waterfront Committee. My name is Majid Abdul Samad, and I am the chair of the committee. Tonight, we're joined by Assistant District Manager Brendan Berth, and the meeting is called to order at 6:34. As a reminder, New York State law requires all community board members who are not able to attend the meeting in person to have their cameras on and their first and last names displayed from the time the meeting is called to order until the time the meeting is adjourned. Members of the public who are attending virtually, you can raise any questions or comments through the Q&A feature of Zoom. Members of the public who are here in person, please raise your hand and I'll identify you to speak. Larry kindly volunteered to take meeting minutes tonight. Thank you so much, Larry. With that, Brendan, can we take roll call, please?
Okay, committee members, I will call your name. When your name is called, please say present. I will announce that there is quorum. Majid Abdul Samad.
Present.
Victoria Benatar. I don't see. Jen Collins isn't with us. Alec Militic.
Present.
Rich Mintz.
Present.
Larry Shire.
Present.
Sandra Sherrod.
Present.
Letty Simon is not with us tonight. Susan Steinberg is on her way. Mark Thompson.
Present.
Gabe Terzo.
Present.
James Vera.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
All right, the agenda for tonight's meeting was distributed ahead of time by the board office and is reflected on the screen before you. If there's no objections, we'll adopt the agenda. Members of the committee, if you object, please raise your hand.
Oh, just want to remember that.
Yes.
solar too.
So thank you for that. Actually, we are going to amend this because we just got a note from EDC that they're unable to attend. So the second item is going to be struck and we'll jump straight to the third line. So to that amended agenda, if there are no objections, we will adopt it. Seeing none, the agenda for tonight is adopted. And the meeting minutes from the April 16th meeting were distributed ahead of time by the board office. If there's no objection, we'll adopt them as drafted. Again, members of the committee, if you object, please raise your hand. Seeing none, meeting minutes from April 16th meeting are adopted and they'll soon be available on the CV6 website. Quick ground rules in order to conduct an efficient meeting, observing the following. No one may speak until granted the floor. Committee members who are here in person, if you have a question about committee business or wish to make a motion, please raise your hand and I'll identify you to speak. Committee members unable to attend in person, if you have a question about committee business, you may raise your hand through Zoom and I'll identify you to speak. All committee members, it's extremely important that one person speaks at a time so members of the public watching at home can understand what is being said by each committee member. The chat function for committee members present via Zoom should not be used for committee business or questions about agenda topics. All such remarks should be made on the record by raising your hand through Zoom. Chat should only be used to alert us to any technical difficulties you are facing or to state in writing information like an email address that was already stated on the record in the meeting. Victoria. No, you're good. You're welcome. So before we jump to our agenda, welcome to two new members, James and Alec. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll just give you 30 seconds to introduce yourself to everybody. Okay. Whoever would like to. You are here.
Sure, I'll go
to go first.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. My name is Alec. I'm excited to join the Land Use and Waterfront Committee. I am an urban planner. So naturally this aligns with my interests. So I'm really excited to contribute and to be part of this committee.
Alec, what's your last name?
Militic.
Did I get your pronunciation correct? Or no?
How did you pronounce it?
Militant.
Yes.
Okay. And if, by the way, if I say any of your names incorrectly, correct me.
Welcome, Alec.
Thank you.
All right, all expert questions go to Alec now. He's
Designated expert. Hi, everyone. My name is James Vera. I'm similar to Alec. I'm an architect, so I'm on a smaller bit of detail there, but equally excited to be part of the committee.
And James, how do you spell your last name?
V as in Victor, IRA.
Vienna.
IERA or
IRA,
VIRA?
yes.
Okay.
Okay. All right,
Thank you.
Brendan, Susan also joined, so.
Yep.
Perfect.
And Victoria.
Yeah, thank you, sorry for that.
Okay.
Our county is present.
Thank you.
So with that, we'll jump right in. Our first agenda item is a public hearing. The public hearing must be open for a period of time. So I'll just say, this is a public hearing on the proposed city FES for housing opportunity. It's now open. If any members of the public want to speak on this matter and are here in person, please raise your hand. If any members of the public want to speak on this and are on Zoom, please raise your hand through Zoom or indicate your written statement or any questions in the Q&A. You will have up to 3 minutes to speak. Remember that before you begin speaking, you must state your full name and your affiliation.
We could also ask them to spell it for the.
For the minutes, yes, please. Okay, with that, welcome folks from DCP. Hi, Ali, hi, Aska, and hi, John. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, the floor is yours.
Oh, great. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today to talk about the Department of City Planning's proposal, City of Yes, for housing opportunity. My name is Allie, and I'm the Community Board Liaison for CB6 at City Planning. I'm joined today by my colleagues Ozka and John. Ozka is the Manhattan East Side team leader, and John is the director of our housing division. This is an ambitious proposal with many components, so I've tailored today's presentation to focus on the elements that are most relevant to CB6, while also giving an overview of how we're addressing this, the housing crisis citywide. After my presentation, we'll have time for Q&A. As always, any questions that we can't answer tonight, we'll bring back to the project team and then provide answers to you in writing as soon as we can. I want to acknowledge that CB6 has already been thinking hard about this proposal, and we received your resolution on the topic last week. Hopefully in this presentation, I can address some of the concerns that you've raised, and we can also talk about them more in the discussion after the presentation. We really appreciate the Land Use Committee's thorough attention to this proposal and your dedication to helping the city solve our housing crisis. City of Yes for Housing Opportunity is a citywide plan that will encourage incremental housing growth over a wide geography by removing barriers to housing production to build a little bit more housing in every neighborhood. As I know this committee is aware, New York City faces a severe housing shortage. The vacancy rate for rental apartments is historically low, only 1.4%, far below a healthy vacancy rate that would provide New Yorkers with housing options. In Manhattan, the vacancy rate is only 2.33%, down from 10% in 2021. Because our housing demand is greater than our housing supply, New Yorkers are experiencing very high housing costs. Over half of New York City renters are rent burdened, meaning they spend over 30% of their monthly income on rent. Not having enough homes has direct human consequences. One of the most prominent examples of that is homelessness. Each night of 2023, over 92,000 homeless New Yorkers slept in shelters. New York is simply not building enough housing. The chart on the upper right shows housing production over time in New York City. As you can see, most of New York City's housing was created in the first half of the 20th century. Since that time, housing production has fallen dramatically. And while this is just one piece of the puzzle, this is in part because zoning has become increasingly restrictive since 1961. We're also lagging behind other major metropolitan areas, and at the same time, the demand for housing has only increased in New York. So zoning is one tool to help address this crisis. Many city agencies work on policies and programs that aim to address housing needs. The Department of City Planning in particular is responsible for the city's zoning. Zoning regulates what can be built on a particular site, both how big the building can be and what uses it can have, residential or commercial, for example. Zoning can also include requirements for income-restricted affordable housing, but zoning does not fund new housing or directly control what can be built, what will be built. It only establishes the rules. So how much housing gets built depends on many factors. Some examples of other tools that the city uses to support good housing outcomes include subsidies or tax incentives to promote income-restricted affordable housing, programs for affordable home ownership, and tenant protections that guarantee New Yorkers' rights. This amendment is the biggest pro-housing change DCP has ever undertaken, and it would touch the zoning of every single part of the city. In this overview, we're going to start with the low density proposals. Then we'll talk about the medium and high density proposals, which will be more relevant to CB6. And finally, across the city, there are a range of other citywide proposals, which we'll cover last. So firstly, we're going to talk about these low density proposals. These don't apply directly to CB6, but we want to give you an idea of the changes happening in low density parts of the city, primarily in the outer boroughs, as part of our Little Bit of Housing Everywhere strategy. Also, CB6 will be voting on this entire text amendment, including these low density proposals. For context, in many low density neighborhoods, exclusionary zoning rules have made it virtually impossible to build new housing, placing additional pressure on the high density parts of the city. These proposals aim to address this. The town center proposal aims to create more missing middle housing in low density areas. Missing middle is a category of housing that's modest in scale and often affordable to middle income residents, a once common type of housing that's not built in the city very often anymore. This proposal streamlines zoning rules, including restrictive limits on floor area and height, so that it's once again feasible to build 2 to 4 stories of housing above a commercial ground floor in low density commercial overlays, which are shown on this map in red. Our second proposal for missing middle housing is transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development would allow for low-rise buildings about 3 to 5 stories, depending on the underlying zoning, on sites that are near transit and meet specific criteria. In the rest of the low-density areas, the proposal aims to give homeowners more flexibility. Under this proposal, a 1 to 2 family home would be allowed to add a small accessory dwelling unit, or ADU. These small units would provide important housing options for small households, like a young person moving into their own place for the first time, or an elderly resident who wants to age in place. Because of their small size, they also serve different income levels than a large single-family home. In order to allow ADUs and also provide all homeowners with flexibility, we're adjusting rules in these low-density districts. In many areas, even the existing buildings don't comply with the overly restrictive rules, and they can't be altered to meet the needs of families. Furthermore, in many designated 2-family or multifamily districts, the rules are so constraining that it's impossible to build any new housing except for single-family homes. Adjusting these rules will allow homeowners to make alterations to their homes and allow people to actually build a 2-family home in a 2-family district or a multifamily home in a multifamily district. So now we're going to talk about the medium and high density proposals, which again, as I said, apply more to CB6. So the cornerstone of our medium and high density proposals is the Universal Affordability Preference, or UAP proposal. Sandy McKee sent me a question in advance of this meeting to explain UAP, which I will do in this section. UAP will allow buildings to add at least 20% more housing if the additional homes are permanently affordable housing, including supportive housing. This proposal is based on existing zoning rules that allow affordable senior housing to be about 20% bigger than other buildings in most districts. The districts where this applies are shown in yellow on the map. We're expanding this to apply to all affordable and supportive housing, not just for seniors. In some areas where the senior preference doesn't already exist, we're also adding a new 20% bump for permanently affordable housing. These areas where we're adding it because it didn't exist already are shown on the map in orange. Under this proposal, there will be a basic FAR for market rate buildings and then a higher UAP FAR as long as all of the floor area above the basic FAR is affordable. I'm going to go through some examples to better explain this concept, but just want to note that in some areas, there will also be limited increases in height where it's necessary to make room for the additional affordable housing units. Under UAP, any units over the basic FAR will have to be affordable at an average of 60% of the area median income, or AMI, which is a measure of affordability established by the federal government. Income averaging means that not all of the units need to be exactly 60%. Some can be lower and some can be higher with an average of 60%. This allows us to create a range of affordability for households of various income levels. Here you can see an example of what a building might look like with UAP. Without UAP, we have this 8-story apartment building, and with UAP, we have 2 more stories of permanently affordable housing. I'll also go through a couple of scenarios to illustrate how UAP will work in specific cases, and then we'll talk about how it interacts with some of our existing programs, which you may be familiar with. So here's an example of how UAP would function in the construction of a new mixed income housing on a vacant site in an R6 district. The yellow on this drawing shows the additional floor area a developer can build if they include affordable housing. In reality, the affordable housing would be distributed throughout the building. So today they'd get 3 FAR, regardless of whether they're developing market rate or affordable units. This would allow them to build about 35 units. Under UAP, they'd get 3.9 FAR, but note that the extra FAR could only be used for affordable housing. If it is, they can build about 10 to 12 more affordable units. The building would also be allowed to be about 10 feet taller than it would be today. 10 to 12 more affordable units may not sound like a lot, but this is functioning at a citywide scale. If every project has a few more affordable units, we can add a significant amount of affordable housing citywide. I know the board also had a question about how bedroom mix will be regulated under UAP. So for a building like this that has both market rate and affordable floor area, the bedroom mix for the affordable units would have to be proportional to the bedroom mix of the market rate units, or at least 50% of the affordable units would have to be 2 or more bedrooms, and at least 75% have to be 1 or more bedrooms. We can talk about this more if you have additional questions at the end. So this is another example of a city-owned site in an R8B district that's going to be used for entirely affordable housing. Today, R8B districts don't have a preferential FAR for affordable senior housing. So this site is limited to 47 units, no matter what kind of housing they're providing. We're proposing that R8B districts and all other districts with no existing senior housing preference or a very small preference receive a 20% bump for affordable housing. In R8B, this means 4.8 FAR for affordable housing. This building would also be allowed to be 30 feet taller than it would be today. In this example, that translates to an additional 9 to 10 permanently affordable homes. For a 100% affordable building, the bedroom mix would be determined by HPD, Housing Preservation and Development, and this usually depends on the type of building. For example, supportive and senior housing tend to serve single adults, so they usually have fewer multi-bedroom units versus family affordable housing, which usually has a mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. But again, HPD would determine the bedroom mix for a 100% affordable building, unlike the mixed income building that I showed before. This table shows the proposed adjustments to FAR and height limits under UAP for R6 through R8. Buildings would only be able to use the UAP FARs and heights if all of the housing above the basic FAR is affordable. We want to make sure that every medium and high density zoning district has a preference for affordable housing and make sure that the building envelopes can actually fit this affordable housing. These are the proposed FARs and Heights for R9 through R12 districts. I sent these slides to Brendan so he can share them with you all and you can look through them in more detail. But for now, I'm going to move on and talk about how UAP interacts with our existing programs. So UAP is replacing our voluntary inclusionary housing program, which includes both inclusionary housing designated areas, which are shown here in green, and R10 districts and equivalents, which are shown here in blue. Like UAP, these existing tools are optional zoning tools to incentivize the creation of affordable housing. As you can see on the map, they cover a relatively limited part of the city, only about 13% of medium and high density districts. Today, UAP will extend a preference for affordable housing citywide to all medium and high density districts. UAP also has other benefits compared to VIH, or voluntary inclusionary housing. VIH has an AMI fixed at 80%, while UAP has a lower AMI of 60% and allows for income averaging, like we talked about before. Currently, VIH can only create housing for New Yorkers at 80% AMI, or an annual income of about $101,700 for a family of 3. UAP will provide housing at a range of incomes due to income averaging. There could be a mix of homes at different income levels, including more deeply affordable units and slightly higher income units. The table on this slide shows an example of what that mix might look like. The Housing Opportunity Proposal will also make updates to our existing Mandatory Inclusionary Housing Program, or MIH. First, this proposal will allow for MIH Option 3 to be a standalone option. Option 3 is currently known as the deep affordability option and requires that 20% of the residential floor area should be affordable at an average of 40% AMI. Our proposal will also equalize MIH FARs for districts where the UAP FAR is higher. For example, in an R6A district, the MIH FAR will change from 3.6 to 3.9. It's important to note that the options would remain in place for MIH, meaning that the same MIH percentage of affordability will continue to be required even if the MIH FAR is brought up to meet the UAP FAR. Finally, we're proposing to streamline the rules for 100% affordable projects. Under the new regime, 100% affordable projects would not be subject to overlapping and conflicting regulations in the zoning text. This proposal would also exempt 100% affordable home ownership projects from rules that prevent them from penciling out. The current MIH program is incompatible with some tools that facilitate affordable home ownership, so we're seeking to fix that. Returning to our scenarios, I'll walk through an example of how the UAP proposal interacts with a mandatory inclusionary housing area. Let's say there's a site in an R7A district. It was recently rezoned and is subject to MIH. The current maximum MIH FAR is 4.6, which on this site results in about 54 units. Depending on the MIH area, 25 to 30% of the units would be required to be affordable. Because the UAP FAR in R7A districts is 5, the MIH FAR will also be raised to 5, but the MIH affordability requirement will remain in place. In this scenario, that would mean approximately 59 total units would be created, 25 to 30% of which are permanently affordable, depending on the MIH option of the MIH area. Now we're going to take a look at the citywide proposals. The first proposal is the creation of new zoning districts above 12 FAR. The maximum FAR for R11 and R12 districts will be 15 and 18 FAR respectively. These zoning districts can only be mapped with mandatory inclusionary housing. In addition, this proposal would create two new medium density districts, R62 and R6D. These new districts are proposed to fill the gap in the existing spectrum of zoning districts. It's important to note that no mapping actions are included as part of City of Yes for Housing Opportunity, meaning that a separate action would be required to map these districts if appropriate locations are identified in the future. This proposal would also make it easier to add contextual infill to campuses and other irregular or challenged sites. Previous campus development often took place under tower in the park style regulations called height factor. Although DCP has developed a more recent set of regulations for contextual buildings that have height limits and result in better designs, some sites, like NYCHA campuses, can't access those new rules. The proposed changes would allow height-limited contextual infill on sites that would otherwise be forced to develop tall, skinny buildings or nothing at all. A variety of other changes would address barriers faced by irregular or challenged sites. These include making more sites eligible for contextual envelopes and eliminating the outdated sliver law when using height-limited contextual envelopes.
Sorry,
So-
Ali, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Can we just clarify what silver law is?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently, there's something called the sliver law, which I know that George Janes explained this to you a couple weeks ago, but I'll just go through what it is. I have a slide in the appendix which I can pull up, but the sliver law is basically on narrow lots. Let me just pull it. Oh, sorry. On
Ali, I can jump in.
Okay,
It's helpful.
go ahead.
So essentially, it's a part of the zoning resolution where sites that are below 45 feet wide in certain districts can't build taller than the width of the street they're on. So on narrow streets, for example, that are below 60 feet, a 45 wide lot can only build up to 60 feet. It's one of those like outdated height limiting regulations that were first put in place when we didn't have height regulations or zoning didn't really control height. But since then we've had a lot of our zoning has different height regulations in terms of contextual buildings and all of those. So it's sort of an outdated thing that has remained, but can just be replaced with the contextual zoning we have.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Also, sliver law won't be required as long as you're using these new contextual height limited rules instead. But just to go back, campuses are defined as sites 1.5 acres or larger, or sites that have full control of the block. In medium and high density areas, this proposal would do two things. First, it would replace mixing rules that prevent zoning lots from developing that were developed with height factor buildings from adding contextual height limited buildings. Second, it would align the distance between building rules with the existing multiple dwelling law. In practice, this means a 40-foot distance between buildings. And for buildings that are over 125 feet, the distance must be at least 80 feet between buildings. The next proposal would remove outdated rules that prevent small and shared apartments. The next proposal would remove outdated rules that prevent small and shared apartments. One of the points that the Land Use Committee made in the recent resolution that we received is that the city should permit smaller units, which is what we're doing in this proposal. What this means is allowing buildings with only simple no-frills studios, as well as homes with private bedrooms but shared kitchens or other common facilities. These building types have historically played an important role in New York's housing landscape, especially for young working New Yorkers. New small and shared apartments can provide important housing choices, especially for marginally housed New Yorkers and people who would prefer to live alone but can't afford to do so. Today, we're forcing people into living situations that they don't want. In some cases, that includes doubling up in an overcrowded unit. But our lack of housing options also is what forces young professionals to team up with roommates and occupy family-sized units. Our current zoning doesn't have a clear path for building shared housing, so housing opportunity would create clear rules to make the process less complex to enable a fuller range of shared housing options. These updated rules would make it possible to build shared housing in any multifamily zoning district, including affordable shared housing. Housing Opportunity is also seeking to legalize existing unregulated shared housing. The way that we're allowing smaller apartments is by changing a rule called the dwelling unit factor, which requires buildings to have a minimum average dwelling size. This proposal would eliminate the dwelling unit factor in transit-rich areas shown here in dark green and reduce it everywhere else. Our next citywide proposal includes some changes to enable more conversions. First, we'll change the eligible geography from business districts in Manhattan and limited areas in Queens and Brooklyn to the entire city. This will allow for the conversion of buildings beyond just large offices, like schools or former religious buildings. Secondly, we'll allow more recent buildings to have access to our more flexible reuse regulations. Today, a building must be built prior to 1961 or 1977, depending on what part of the city it's in order to use the more flexible conversion rules. We'll move this cutoff date to 1990, allowing underused buildings from the 70s and 80s to convert to housing. Finally, our current adaptive reuse regulations only apply when a non-residential building is converting to traditional apartments. But office floor plates, for example, may work better for other kinds of housing, like shared housing or dorms, which will now be allowed under new regulations. Our next citywide proposal seeks to expand the existing landmark transfer of development rights program. The landmark TDR program was created in the 1960s to help relieve the financial burden on designated landmarks, which are subject to maintenance requirements and limited in their ability to redevelop or add new buildings to a lot. This proposal would extend transfer opportunities to allow transfer to other zoning lots on the same block as the landmark or immediately across the street or an intersection from the block. You can see the difference between the current regulations and what we're proposing in the diagram on the right. The proposal would also streamline the approval process, requiring a certification when no bulk modifications are necessary to accommodate the transfers on the receiving site, or an authorization when an applicant is seeking bulk modifications. Currently, the Landmark TDR program is not available for landmarks in historic districts or in low-density districts, which is R1 through R5. So this proposal would expand the applicability of the Landmark TDR program to those areas. These expansions would help generate revenue to maintain landmarks while also unlocking additional housing opportunities. Finally, our last proposal is to eliminate required parking minimums in new buildings citywide. These rules already exist in most of Manhattan, including CB6. Sorry. But elsewhere in the city, mandated parking is extremely expensive to provide, and parking mandates drive up rents and prevent new housing from being built. It's important to note that parking will still be allowed, and projects can add the amount of parking that they believe to be appropriate at the location. That concludes the overview of proposals within this text amendment. I know that was a lot of detail, so we can come back to any section that you have questions about. But I first want to quickly summarize the text amendment as a whole and also the process going forward. So the changes I walk through tonight are the most significant proposals in City of Yes for housing opportunity. Overall, this text amendment aims to create a little more housing everywhere so that each neighborhood does its part to addressing our housing needs. Sorry, I have a cough a little bit, but this is not just about more housing. It's also about more types of housing, multifamily housing where it's not currently allowed because of exclusionary zoning, homes of different sizes to meet different people's needs, and crucially, far more affordable and supportive housing. In addition to this presentation, which again I've shared with the board, DCP has created many more documents to help explain this text amendment, including an illustrated guide, one-pagers explaining the different proposals, and the full annotated zoning text, all of which can be found at our website, nyc.gov/yes housing opportunity. Lastly, here is our timeline for the text amendment. The community board will have 60 days to review the proposal, although we'll accept resolutions all the way up until the vote, which will be in early fall. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and we're happy to take any questions that you have and go back to any slides if I walked through them too quickly. I know that was a lot of information.
All right, thank you so much, Ali. And actually, while we're on this slide, I'll just mention this will be presented at Borough Board this Thursday at 8:30, Manhattan Borough President's Office. That's 1 Center Street. And it's scheduled to take a vote on June 20th at full Borough Board. So that's so where if you want to attend, and that's kind of the deadline we're working towards to submit our take on this. With that, Susan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. It's really a framework, but you mentioned George James' presentation to us. He went into a lot more detail about the infill concept. My name is Susan Steinberg, and I'm the president of the Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village Tenants Association. And when he made his presentation, he showed us a couple of slides that indicated that infill would allow for another 1.5 million square feet of buildings. I'd like to point out that Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village has a population of about 30,000. This is dense, 110 buildings. It's the size of bigger than some of the small cities upstate. And I really can't imagine that we would end up having 200 buildings and 50,000 people. I mean, some of that infill sounded pretty extreme, and we're very concerned about that. The complex has a very old infrastructure. I really can't see, frankly, a little more housing on this campus. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Susan. I'm John Mangan. I'm head of the housing division. Ellie and Oscar, I hope you don't mind if I hop in here, because Chair Garodnick had our urban design division actually do a site analysis of Stuytown. You know, he has personal connections to the site, as we all know. Site analysis of the campus under the existing zoning and under our proposals. And our urban design division found that the proposed zoning changes don't create any new sites, development sites on the campus. That's largely a function of the fact that, like, as you know, if you look at Stuyvesant Town from above, the buildings are almost perfectly spaced out. So there's just not a lot of footprint on the site to add any new buildings in. And because Stuyvesant Town has basically an inexhaustible supply of unused development rights today, any additional floor area provided by the housing opportunity proposals, say through UAP for 100% affordable housing, you know, it's basically irrelevant, because you wouldn't be able to use what you have today even to access any new floor area that's being developed on the site. Also, I know that Stuytown has, you know, every few years, folks come in and analyze, you know, what could happen there. Since the last time that may have happened, there are stricter interpretations of the requirements for street access as well. And so basically any sites on the interior that aren't on the, you know, against First Avenue, or is it, what is it? 14th Street or 20th Street. I can't remember exactly which streets those are. If you're not on those sites, then you can't build anything on the interior without going for a GCL 36 waiver as well. So we uncovered that in our analysis too. And then reducing distance between buildings from 60 feet to 40 feet, consistent with multiple dwelling law. You know, because you can abut buildings today and avoid that entirely, it doesn't create any opportunities there as well. Well, we're very excited for opportunities on the margin for infill development on campus sites around the city. For better or for worse, Stuyvesant Town does not appear to have any of those opportunities, and we're happy to share more detail with you if you want in the future. But like I said, Chair Garodnick really pressed us on that, and that's what we uncovered.
Thank you very much. I feel better.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, we were on it. We were on it.
We did a real deep dive into it because we also received your memo.
Got it. Thank you both.
Doing your job.
All right, Rich, then Sandra.
Just a real quick clarification on UAP. The 20% bonus is a bonus in floor area, not in units. Is the affordability averaging also based on floor area, or is it based on the number of units?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's a great question. It's based on the amount of floor area so that you can't play games with, market rate units versus affordable units and try to find loopholes by altering the sizes of units or anything like that. It's just a straight percentage of floor area to avoid all those shenanigans.
Okay, thank you.
So actually, can I ask a follow-up on that? On the UAP, and this is just more a general question. A lot of these, as exciting as they are opt-in, just like DIH was, and therefore you're just not mandating any affordability. And when you're saying, okay, you increase that and you have to do 60% AMI, what's the economic incentive for a developer to do it? They'll simply say, all right, nice to have, but just doesn't make economic sense.
That's an absolutely great question. And the not so secret about zoning programs for affordability throughout recent history, since the 80s, is basically they need to work in conjunction with some other means of support. And sometimes that's subsidy from HPD. More often, that's a tax benefit at the state level. And so like the voluntary inclusionary housing programs before it, which worked with the 421A tax benefit, we expect that UAP will work with the new 485X tax benefit. And the way that works now is that the tax benefit is attractive. It induces developers of rental housing to participate. And then UAP drives AMIs down from 80 in most cases to an average of 60% AMI. So that together, in conjunction with each other, the tax benefit and UAP get you more and better affordable housing than either would alone. And we were crossing our fingers. We were working as closely as we could with state legislators on this. And we actually think that the recently passed 45X tax benefit works pretty well with UAP. And again, and that when you use them together, you'll get more and better affordable housing than either alone. And that's what gives UAP the power to be a real workhorse, because it works not just with affordable senior or 100% affordable housing or 100% supportive housing, but it can also work with privately financed housing to create, we expect, tens of thousands of income restricted units in the decade or so ahead. And that's more than all of our inclusionary programs have created in New York City since their advent in the 1980s. So we're extremely excited about UAP.
Got it. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Actually, that was a question I was going to ask, but part of the comment is that the 421A in many people's view is very problematic in terms of what it costs the city to do it. So it would seem, in order for us to understand this, because I thought, what's the incentive for the developers? Because it's not there. That fairly has to be this issue of the tax incentive. For us to fairly vote on it or understand what we're voting on should be in the document. Otherwise, it looks like, gee, the developers are much kinder than I thought them to be. So that's a comment, but I think fairly that's got to be spelled out sometimes.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I mean, we should put that more prominently in our materials. Like I said, mandatory inclusionary housing, the existing voluntary programs, they all require a tax benefit in order to be financially feasible. And that's no different with UAP. And like I said, we're just so fortunate that 45X seems to have landed in a good spot and we're ready to start producing affordable units.
One other question. When one of the decisions is about the size of housing, who they're being constructed for. So what's the data that you have about the need for single people, for families of various sizes? What's the data that you use?
Gotcha. I would say the most fundamental data that underlies this whole proposal is just our historically low vacancy rates, 1.41%, which is the lowest since 68, since before the big population plunge in the 1970s, and our historically high rents. And we think that paints a pretty clear picture of a housing shortage and the consequences of that housing shortage in terms of rents, gentrification, displacement pressure, overcrowding, segregation, homelessness, and everything else. We also know that people feel it. You know, I mean, open houses in recent years have had lines around the block. People understand viscerally if there are 100 people there to look at an open house that landlords can charge whatever they want, basically. We were seeing bidding wars breaking out on front stoops. You know, you can read the paper, you know, it's just the housing shortage is just increasingly in our face in ways that are impossible to deny.
No, that was the question, the question was, how do you decide the distribution of how large an apartment should be? Are there, you know, is the majority of the families that are really desperate for housing, 4 people families, 5 people families? Because the emphasis like on this, you know, I think of SROs, you know, when you're talking about people living jointly, it's about single, and I hear single young people coming to the city. My question is, where's the real need in terms of families?
Right. You know, I mean, I was getting there. In large part, we don't think it's appropriate for the zoning to try to determine what people should build. You know, it largely, you know, many of the proposals for housing opportunity are trying to remove restrictions that have gotten in the way of serving important niches of the housing market in recent decades. But we do have pretty clear evidence that we're underproducing, especially smaller units. I mean, there's just been a long-term secular decline in PPH, people per households, around the nation, including in New York City. You know, if you go back to 1940s, we were about 3.5 people per household. You know, it was not uncommon to see whole families crowded into 1-bedroom apartments. Today, we're significantly lower, about 2.5 people per household. And that includes, like Ali pointed out, you know, many people who have to team up with roommates and go take family-sized units in, you know, gentrifying neighborhoods. Who's going to get that 2-bedroom in Crown Heights? Is it going to be the college graduate with a $70,000 salary teaming up with the college graduate with a $90,000 salary? Or is it going to be the mother and 2 kids? You know, it's going to be the college graduates every time. And so we see an important aspect of enabling more small and, you know, shared housing models that we've seen in other jurisdictions around the country is taking pressure off of some of those family size units. That doesn't mean that people won't continue to build family size units. In fact, our analysis shows that, you know, most of the time developers will continue to provide, you know, 2 and even 3-bedroom units in new developments, but it does create some opportunities on the margin for this style of development that we used to have in New York City that served as a really important first foothold in the city for, you know, people just moving here for the first time. Also, you know, we have existing informal shared housing arrangements that we can't legalize, leaving those residents very vulnerable. And so, you know, we're not just talking about tech bros moving to the city for the first time. We're also talking about, you know, the population that would have been served by SROs in the past before we banned them in the 1950s. So it's a dynamic market. We see niches that are underserved, and we are trying to get out of the way of serving those niches.
Actually, just to follow up on that, is there currently, whether in this or in general PCP guidelines, a minimum size for unit that is observed here?
Gotcha. So we do in the zoning today have a thing called dwelling unit factor, which Ali touched on, which serves basically as a minimum average unit size. It's kind of a funny thing to have in the zoning because it's not really a land use regulation. If you go back to the old City Planning Commission reports when we were implementing this, it's actually pretty funny. The City Planning Commission said, we need to keep Manhattan from being overtaken by stewardesses, like literally, that's in the CPC report. We need to keep Manhattan from being overrun by stewardesses. And so we need to implement a minimum average unit size to make sure that we are creating like multi-bedroom units in Manhattan still. Now, there are regulations outside of the zoning, Housing Maintenance Code, Building Code, Americans with Disabilities Act, which create an effective minimum unit size of around 400 or so square feet. We do not expect developers to build a bunch of developments that are full of 400 square foot units, but we do want to create opportunities for developments that are full of studios or 1-bedrooms to, again, serve that important and underserved niche in the housing market.
Got it. Thank you. Victoria, that's it.
I have a question. I wanna ask if you can, develop a little more on the senior housing rules. I understood that you cannot devote some units for seniors, but as I hear, you can devote in regular buildings unit for seniors, is that the case? Or I'm misunderstanding?
Let me know if I'm answering your question. You may be referring to the fact that under state human rights law,
Exactly.
it requires a waiver to provide affordable senior units along with market rate unrestricted units. And I think that the purpose for that is you see a lot of jurisdictions when they have to provide affordable housing, just wanting to provide senior housing because seniors are seen as, innocuous. They don't make noise, they don't commit crimes, things like that. And so the preference for senior housing can actually verge into like fair housing violations. And so when you're trying to combine senior affordable with non-age restricted market rate units, it requires a state law waiver. And in fact, in New York City, when we create affordable senior housing, it tends to be in 100% affordable housing developments by specialized providers that know how to provide the amenities and services that seniors need. And so we don't expect that to change in the future. The amount of senior housing we produce in the city is basically controlled by the amount of subsidy that's allocated to it and how fast HPD can get it out the door. And that would remain. So we expect senior housing production to remain relatively steady under housing opportunity proposals.
And a full 100% senior housing buildings, not scattered.
Typically, yes. When HPD subsidizes affordable senior housing, it's in 100% affordable senior buildings.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sandy, do you want to go next?
I wondered, you talked about, and the rental rates. What about empty condos and co-ops in New York City? I mean, one of the things we've been hearing is that it's not about more housing, it's about making affordable housing. And so does this really address, we don't seem to be having a housing crisis for luxury condos. So do you feel this addresses that issue?
Yes, I mean, we recently had the housing and vacancy survey for 2024 or 2023 come out. And we are not seeing high vacancy rates for any type of housing in the city right now. That said, if we have vacant units, especially if it's like vacant rent stabilized units or something like that, it's important to get every one of those units online. But we're only seeing maybe a few tens of thousands of vacant units in the city, where we see the need, the order of magnitude is on the hundreds of thousands of units. So while every little bit counts, and while we're working with HPD to try to ensure that any vacant units are brought back online, it's only going to be one tiny part of the problem, or one tiny part of the solution. And so we need to explore all options, including building a lot of additional housing and affordable housing as well.
Maybe that's vacant, as in no one's living there, but the units are vacant. Do you have a sense of that? I mean, for luxury condos, we seem to have a lot of luxury condos.
That is the word on the street, but the data have not borne that out at HPD. We don't have, Lucy Jaffe from HPD to comment more deeply on the data, but it's something that we've seen in the housing vacancy survey, and it's just not showing up. The popularly imagined, hundreds of thousands of vacant luxury condos is not being borne out in the data.
And maybe just as like a sort of follow-up, are the conversions required to have an affordable component to them?
This is a great story. That great question, and happy to answer this question. So the proposed changes for conversions and adaptive reuse and housing opportunity build on the existing rules, which we have known and we really love since the 1980s. There's no affordability requirement in that, but we lobbied the state legislature really hard this year for a tax incentive to support affordability in conversions, and we got it. And the word is that it is generous and attractive, and that we expect a lot of developers who are converting buildings to use it. in which case those conversions will include 25% affordable housing at an AMI of 80%. So for the first time for conversions, no matter how old the building is, we are expecting to see a significant set aside for affordable. And so we're really excited about that.
So you said 80% of AMI?
That's right. 25% set aside and 80% AMI.
Larry?
I have a couple of questions, different areas. First is circling back to the occupancy of units. There are changes in family size that inevitably happen. And you speak about how much square footage used to be viewed as being necessary for the dwelling in these units. If a couple live in a one-bedroom apartment, they have twins, more or less forced to find new housing. Is there any, well, it depends on their income level, I guess. And I speak anecdotally from living in Stuyvesant Town and hearing the conversations of couples who are saying, yeah, well, now I have to move out. Now, in the 1940s or another period of time that you were describing, they would simply, parents would sleep in the living room, give the kids the bedroom, or vice versa. So there are cultural aspects to what your expectations are. This zoning change account for that, or is there any commentary that accounts for that?
That's a great question. And the zoning change does touch on that in, in at least one significant way. One of the undersung aspects of this is that we are trying to fix some issues with the HPD administration of affordable housing created through the zoning that we've seen today or over the last couple decades. And one of those is difficulties that occupants of affordable housing face if and when they need to move around in a building. And one of the small but significant changes that we're making to the way that HPD administers affordable housing created through the zoning is to enable them to reallocate units in a building to households that already reside there as their needs change over time. And so newly under these proposals, for instance, if you had a couple in a one bedroom that had twins, then they would be able to seek a 2-bedroom, for instance, in that affordable building when it came open, rather than having to start at square one through the lottery and take their chances that way. So it's just one example of the way where we're learning from things that have worked less well than they could in the past and trying to improve them going forward.
I have a second area that I wanted to go into, and nobody's brought this up before, but you spoke about the landmarks and the transfer of development rights from a landmark to a wide swath around that particular building. No mention is made of historic districts, which may be where a landmark is anchored, and what the effect of making significant building size changes in that historic district, which is intended to preserve a look and feel, what that's going to do. And if those considerations with respect to creating a historic district have not been violated.
Another great question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks, Allie. That's another great question. If the receiving site is in a historic district, then it will get LPC review, just as any other changes within a historic district do. It would have to get a certificate of appropriateness. If it couldn't get a certificate of appropriateness, then that transfer could not happen.
So actually, as a follow-up to that, what is the role of the community in there? So let's say Tudor City, transfers however much FAR to their neighbors. Does the community board get a say on it? Do the neighbors get a say on it?
So if the receiving site requires any changes to the zoning at all in order to accommodate the transfer of development rights, then it does go through the community board and the city planning commission. If, however, the receiving site can accommodate those development rights without any changes to the zoning at all, then we propose it would be just a certification, because nothing is happening on that site that wasn't already possible under the existing zoning. We don't see the need for further review. And just backing up a step, this is all part of the process to make this an actually workable thing. Landmark TDRs were created back in the 60s. We've had a grand total of 12 transfers since then, all of which were in Midtown or in the financial district, not incidentally the highest value, highest density parts of the city. It's just not something that's workable outside of those contexts, leaving many landmarks high and dry. Since we proposed this, I've had a meeting with like a landmarked Episcopal church in Crown Heights that needs a new roof. They are ecstatic because this provides them with realistic transfer opportunities to multiple sites, such that, you know, they can get a good price for those development rights and replace that roof. It just extends this program to a much wider range of landmarks, fulfilling its original purpose.
Got it. So another follow-up on that, understanding that this is really once in a decade, if not more, zoning changes. It's not going to happen very often. Why is there not an affordability requirement for these? If you're transferring those, folks are getting a little more FAR. Why is there not even 10, 20% incentive?
Well, the purpose of this program is to compensate landmarks and to help defer the costs, the extraordinary costs that they bear in maintaining the landmark and in the missed opportunity, since they can't use those development rights on their site. If we were to come in and say, put an affordability requirement on there, we're just taking all that value away from them, which undermines the whole purpose of the landmark TDR program in the first place. And since we're not creating any new development rights, we don't really see that as an appropriate opportunity for affordability mandates either.
But just to understand that, if they're building what they could build as of right, why do they need the development rights?
So
Like how?
on the receiving site, let's say you're on a corner lot in an R8A or whatever, they could, you are transferring development rights to that site that they don't have today. So there's a 7.2 FAR cap on that site today. Say they would get another 1 FAR or something, get up to 8.2. So they are getting more development rights on that site than they otherwise could. But if they can fit that within the existing building envelope, that is, they don't need height waivers, they don't need yard waivers, they don't need, you know, any kind of waivers. That's what we mean there. They're able to fit all those development rights within their existing envelope. And so you don't need any zoning changes. And so we don't think it needs to get environmental review or commission review or anything like that.
Got it. Right.
It strikes me that a landmark only gets one chance to transfer development rights, after which they have nothing to support future renovations that are and restorative needs. Is there some sort of a way that this could be structured, or maybe there's a requirement that an endowment be created so that the landmark isn't going to blow all the money in one place at one time out of desperation?
That's a great question. So the way the program works today is that part of the approval, part of the requirements for approval is a continuing maintenance plan from LPC. So it's not like you just get to sell your development rights and then, you know, run off to, I don't know, Bermuda or whatever. You have to re-up your continuing maintenance plan with LPC as a condition. And so I think that largely addresses the concerns that you're looking at.
Got it. Okay. Anne, I see your hands up, and then we got a couple questions from public. Go ahead, Anne.
Okay, just give me a moment to unmute Anne. Anne, you should be able to speak now.
Yep, I think I can.
Yep.
So I do have a bunch of questions, and I will keep it to a couple and email the rest of them. the first one was just sharing a thought about the 80% versus 60% AMI. We, a few years ago, had a lot of conversation about this, and the idea that a 60% AMI kind of keeps the district, it does not make the district more mixed. Like, it does not help middle class folks. Like, it doesn't help firemen and plumbers and such. So that was one thought. And the other thing, you kind of skated over the question about this doesn't create new districts. So what does create new districts? Like, do those still go through Euler?
Those are really good questions. So today, the voluntary inclusionary program just creates units at 80% AMI and only 80% AMI. If your family doesn't earn 79% of AMI, then you're totally out of luck. I think you could argue that given what income limits have done in recent years, 80% AMI, or as Ali said, about 100,000 for a family of three, that's kind of middle income-ish these days. Right. But we're doing two things. We're driving it down to 60, but we're enabling income averaging. And that's the big thing. This is the thing I'm most excited about because it enables affordable units at a range. We hit lower incomes than we can hit today. I fully expect to see units all the way down to 30% AMI, which is, $1,000 in rent for a new construction 2-bedroom. But conversely, if you see 30, you're going to see 90 as well. And that is, 110,000 or so for a family of three. So it will create units for families at a range of incomes, including really struggling folks and, your firefighter and your school teacher and things like that as well. And I see that as just, pretty fabulous that this program can create units at a range of incomes rather than a glut at just one income. And then your next question was, I'm sorry, can you remind me what your second question was?
You said there was a slide about you can create new districts.
Oh, right.
But this doesn't do it. And it was like, okay, so what does create new districts? And especially the R12s, that's an issue in this, which you did not mention at all.
No, you're exactly right. Your impulse is exactly right. If we wanted to map these districts anywhere in the city, it would have to go through full ULURP and full environmental review, just like any other map change. So think of it as we're creating this tool that will live in the zoning resolution until such time as somebody proposes it. It might be a private applicant, it might be us, it might be the city. We'll see, but it'll get full environmental review and full land use review at that time. These R11 and R12 districts would have no applicability after CHO is enacted.
Can I ask, Majay, one more question that I think is a quickie?
Sure, if it hasn't been asked, go for it.
So a bunch of these, it looks to me like they add about 10 to 15% more housing, which I think is great. But some of those, they are taking them out of what would have gone through ULURP before. And so I'm just wondering about the reviews that might otherwise have happened about, light and shadow and schools, grocery stores, transit, and, those kinds of issues. Should we be worried about that?
Gotcha. No, those are good questions. So in most—
And corridors.
No corridors. I can handle that one. We scrambled to address that issue about 10 years ago, I would say. And we are even strengthening HPD oversight around any developer shenanigans. Anything that potentially stigmatizes the residents of affordable housing is within the authority of HPD to address under our proposed rules. That's in 2700 of the proposed text. So good question. As for what this newly enables through UAP, for instance, in most medium and high density districts, we are just extending the existing senior affordable preference to all forms of affordable and supportive housing. So no new max FAR, no new max heights or anything like that. We're strictly just broadening the types of affordable housing that can qualify for that higher FAR. So it really clicks into the existing districts. Now, there are some districts that Ali explained that don't have a preference for affordable senior today, where we would propose a new 20% preference. You can bet that we have analyzed that in the context of our environmental review. We can send you links to that if you haven't seen it already. It's a very broad and far-reaching environmental review that looks at the effects of these proposals in every one of the 197 neighborhood tabulation areas that allow residential in New York City today. And you know, you should take a look at that, and we can talk about things like that at a follow-up meeting if the community board is interested.
Thank you.
I want to ask you another question. Have the city, with the difficulty there is to convert existing commercial office building into residential, have the city thought about the possibility of creating new artist studio or loft, like a little bit like Soho was back in the day, or Tribeca?
Gotcha. So I would characterize our conversion proposals like this. We are pretty dramatically expanding the geography, you know, from Manhattan below 60th Street, parts of Brooklyn and Queens along East River. We're just expanding that citywide so that we can hit all neighborhoods, all types of non-residential buildings, including, you know, old, you know, decommissioned Catholic schools and, you know, other buildings like that. We're moving the cutoff date from 1961, 1977, all the way up to 1990, so we can hit more recent buildings. And we're expanding the types of housing you can convert to, not just full-on apartments, but also supportive dorms, small and shared apartments, things like that. What we are not doing is altering the light and air standards that exist today for those types of conversions. You know, the adaptive reuse regulations provide a relaxed set of light and air standards so that non-residential buildings that can't comply with residential zoning can convert nonetheless to residential. We thought about ways to make that a little more permissive, but we decided that the existing regulations as they are work pretty well. And so we stuck to the geography, you know, the time, the cutoff date, and the types of housing without, for instance, looking at things like windowless bedrooms or, you know, really, really deep and narrow apartments or anything like that. But, you know, Soho, a lot of the conversions in Soho were enabled by the existing regulations, and those will now apply citywide. So it's, you know, the possibilities, there are new possibilities for conversions of that type as well, just under the existing light and air standards.
Thank you. Any questions? Go for it.
I have one. Yeah. I was just wondering was there the affordability aspect of it is great, but was there been a study of overall impact of the more units and the affordable housing in terms of driving across the board prices down for housing?
You know, that's such a dynamic and complicated subject. While we know that all else equal, more housing is better than less housing in terms of housing opportunity, in terms of tenant power, in terms of, you know, affordability of rents. It would be extremely difficult, and I don't know how you would design a study that could try to quantify that exactly. So think of it as we know what we have to do, we know what we're aiming towards, but no, there's no study that says if we build X number of units, rents will go down by this much or anything like that. But, you know, the underlying goal that animates this entire process is to try to make the housing market feel different. A housing market at 1.41 net rental vacancy feels pretty soul crushing. We want to move towards a healthier vacancy rate that gives tenants actual housing options. And that's, you know, significantly higher in terms of percentage points. So that's what we're aiming toward.
Thank you. Soul crushing is an excellent way to describe our situation. Go ahead, Larry.
Okay, another area that we haven't covered tonight, but which we've discussed in the past, is the impact in this community district of the failure to build the Second Avenue subway after the Second Avenue elevated and the Third Avenue elevated were removed. This was always anticipated in the developments that took place in the 1950s and 1960s were a tremendous increase in density, and we're proposing even more without coming any closer to tying that into a requirement that the timing of it coincide with the start of construction.
That's a good comment. I mean, we will certainly, pass that along to our colleagues at MTA. They're one of many agencies that we're working on with this set of proposals, but I take your point. It's a good one.
Right, and the fact is they failed to include this in their 20-year needs statements instead of this substituting the 125th Street extension to West Harlem.
Got it. So with that, we're gonna close the public hearing. Actually, can I just ask, Ali, can you flip to the MIH map? And this is just really an uninformed question. Do we have any MIH in CB6? And if not, can you just, like, in 30 seconds, mention how you expand MIH? Knowing that we have a major site, but not to pick on them in our district, but that could use some MIH.
I think we do have a little tiny bit of MIH in Manhattan Community District 6. Let me see if I can remember exactly what was that 30? Let's see there. What is it? Zeroing in here on the map.
And it's less about location and more curious.
I can speak to
yeah,
like
33rd
how.
Street.
Oh, I can speak to your question just of how MIH is mapped. So when there's a rezoning with a significant increase in residential capacity, an applicant, as they're doing their rezoning application, also has to submit an application to map a mandatory inclusionary housing area, which then with that, they have to choose one of these options. So we talked about MIH option 3, which now is going to be a standalone option, but there are also, there's option 1 and option 2, which are currently the main options. And then option 3 right now you can add on, but that locks them in perpetuity to providing a certain percentage of the residential floor area as affordable at a certain AMI. But as I said, it's based on when you're doing a rezoning that has a significant, and usually we understand that as about 40% of an increase in residential capacity. So when you're taking it from a district that has like a lower residential capacity to one that has a higher residential capacity.
And one point also is that our goal is that everywhere in the city we have MIH mapped eventually. So anytime that there is a project that is doing a density increase, we would always map MIH, even if the project is not proposing any residential use currently. So it could be a commercial development, but if they're doing a rezoning, that doesn't matter. We would still map MIH so that in the future, if ever that development were to change or something else were to be built there, that MIH is there permanently.
Got it. Yeah, we have the situation with Spark, and they're coming in next month. And yeah, it's not very. The M is missing in that MIH because it is being activated, but no housing is actually mandated. So that's something that, just for the record, we feel like is a missed opportunity because the site is required to do MIH, but it's not adding any housing.
It does require, it requires that, a certain percentage of the residential floor area be affordable, but if they're not providing any residential floor area, any percent of 0 is still 0, unfortunately. But I'm sure that the Spark team will speak to you more about what they are proposing on that site instead. But Also, just wanted to note that this is sort of why we mentioned that any of those new districts that we're creating, they would always be mapped with MIH because they're larger districts. So they're going to come with an increase in residential capacity, and therefore they will always be mapped with MIH.
Got it. Okay,
Is this the sign with the?
no, the one below. Oh, that's really tiny one. Okay, so from the public comments, Scott, I believe your questions about tax were answered, condos and co-ops, about ceiling height, that's a building code issue, not zoning, so I don't think we want to take it up here. One question for the DCP team, waterfront buildings cannot be more than 100 foot wide. Is there any proposal to make that limit larger regardless of sightline loss?
I can say that we are proposing adjustments to the waterfront envelopes in order to enable them to accommodate more types of housing, in particularly affordable housing. What we found is that when we were mapping waterfront zoning in places that were also intended to produce affordable housing, like Inwood, Special Harlem River Waterfront District, that it required significant modifications to the underlying waterfront envelope in order to make affordable housing work. And so we're just trying to carry those changes through to the underlying so that there are different options that developers can use that accommodate, among other things, affordable housing on those sites. I cannot remember whether we are changing the maximum width because, you know, again, it's important value in waterfront areas to preserve sightlines, but we are making certain other accommodations to base heights and then height above setback to make it easier to produce housing in those areas.
Yeah, thank you very much. So with that, seeing no more questions, comments from the committee or the public hearing on the proposed city of Yes for housing opportunity is now closed. We will need to draft we will need to have our opinion in resolution, and it should be one of the following categories: no objection, favorable, conditional favorable, unfavorable, conditional unfavorable, or waive comment. With that, is there any, and if whoever makes a motion for any of these, please state any special conditions that we want to mention in the therefore be it resolved. Just know whatever we advance here is gonna go to the housing committee. That's gonna make any refinements to it, vote on it in June 11th for the full board to vote on June 12th. This is our chance to actually take a stand on what we heard today. So-
Can I make one last comment, which is just that I know that CB6 probably already knows this from zoning or City of Yes for economic opportunity. But if you want to go ahead and specify which parts of the proposal you really like on your resolution versus which parts that you have comments on, I think you did exactly that in your last resolution, and that is absolutely encouraged for this as well. And if you have any additional comments or questions after the fact that you would like to ask, you can always email me and I'll get them answered by someone at DCP.
Got it. Thank you very much. That's it. Can we make in our resolution a comment about how great those graphics are?
Yeah.
Zoning code's not meant to be sexy, and it's a really cool graphic, so
Exactly, I agree.
kudos to the person who did that. Okay, do we have a motion for a favorable opinion on the proposed City of Yes for housing opportunity text amendment? Or I'll make a motion. Is there a second?
Second, third.
Second.
Perfect.
Fourth.
Can we do a roll call, Brandon, on a favorable take on this, and then we will draft the resolution after and circulate it?
Yeah, can do, if it's a straight favorable and no like comments or feedback.
I feel like they addressed a lot.
Perfect.
It's impressive that they read our resolution. Yeah, I know they're listening, but
We appreciate
not
it.
only read, but digested.
And understood.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. Okay, so this was a motion was made and seconded. Please, Brendan, let's do a roll.
Okay. Just knowing for the record before I do the roll call, and I'll do the roll call, I see that Anne has her hand raised.
We'll come to it right after.
Yep, sounds good. Okay, When I call your name, please say whether you are in favor, opposed, abstain, or not entitled. Majed Abdul Samad,
In favor.
Victoria Benatar,
In favor.
Alec Milicic,
In favor.
Rich Minnis,
In favor.
Larry Shire,
In favor.
Sandra Sherrod,
In favor.
Susan Steinberg,
In favor.
Mark Thompson,
In favor.
Gabe Terzo,
In favor.
and James Vera.
In favor.
Okay, with all 10 committee members in favor, this passes.
Great, thank you very much. DCP folks, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and this explanation. Much appreciated. Rich, can I volunteer you and me to write
Yes.
this?
Yes.
Thank you again. All right, with that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Cindy.
I know that you voted, but did DCP answer all the questions from our previous resolution?
Yes. We crossed them off one by one.
Yeah, it's the heart of it.
Yeah. Okay. I don't see a hand anymore. Okay. Oh, sorry. There is a hand. Go ahead, Anne.
Oh, just a moment, let me give Anne permission to speak. Just hold on a moment. Okay. Now you should be able to speak, Anne.
Okay, Majed, I thought you were gonna, like, your resolution was gonna be like, yes, but we have these concerns because nothing is perfect. How can we actually send a resolution back to DCP saying, yes, this is perfect? Because we do have concerns. Do we not want to have a resolution that says, yes, but?
Oh, what?
So, yeah, if there are concerns, we are more than happy to hear them. And when we can still
Well,
word this in whereases, that being
I mean, I
said,
think they answered our questions, but the fact that they sort of answer them does not commit them. It's not the same as us saying in a resolution, we want you to, make sure you pay attention to these concerns.
got it. Okay, thank you. I understand. This was the motion that was made. No one made a conditional favorable. So that being
Yes.
said, we will vote on this. Let's see, housing folks, maybe there's a different perspective, and we'll regroup before June 12th when the full board votes on it.
Yeah, I
And if you have
anticipate,
any concerns, please bring it up.
Nothing is perfect.
just speaking for the housing committee, I anticipate that there will be some pushback. And we'll see what happens based on what the resolution says that we drafted.
I think it makes us
One
look a
second, I'm
little.
sorry. Just give me 1 second. Thank you.
I mean, we don't have to have a yes, but response to also include our list of concerns, just to make sure that they're codified further.
As you pointed out, they could be identified and ticked off within the whereases.
Yep.
I was assuming that the resolution that you or I were gonna draft was going to enumerate concerns,
Yes.
not just be a yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think all of us anticipate.
I
Perfect.
just always worry that when you send a resolution and it says yes, that's where people stop reading.
Noted. Thank you.
Okay, it starts with, right?
Yes. They kind of helped us with this. Okay, with that, our second agenda item is scrapped from EDC. So we will jump to our much anticipated presentation from CB6 Planning Fellow, Mr. Quick, on the privately owned public spaces.
You see this presentation, okay.
And I only passed by one that was open to the public but gated on the way here.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Amazing.
I'm gonna see,
I saw her,
hopefully that works.
final presentation, so, yeah, I went to,
I don't know if that's gonna work when you're not in presentation.
Yeah.
I think you need to make it like full screen and then you can.
I thought I did make it. I saw I did make it full screen.
Nice way to.
Yeah, we can't see the whole thing.
Oh.
I think the Windows full screen, but not.
Yeah.
Let me see it.
It's actually weird. It doesn't have the option to go.
I think it's been.
The heavy lifting from one.
Oh, maybe she.
If you go- Yeah, but if you go-
And also, you can just say next slide, and I can do that.
Okay. I think that this should.
Presentation, huh?
In the bottom left, where you see, yeah, you can't do it, but he can do it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll try refresh.
go back.
Oh, press escape.
No, that's the,
Oh, that's for
the Zoom overlay.
Oh, no, there you go. Slideshow, top
Oh,
right,
okay, perfect.
behind the share button, behind the stop share. You see the red button,
Okay.
right?
Yeah. There's a lot on the screen.
Much to the point about screen clutter.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, Missy, floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me here today.
Do you want to pull into the?
Oh, yes, so folks can hear me here, please.
Sorry about the delay.
You're good.
Okay, so thank you for having me here today. I know I was here back in March. And so I will be updating you on the project for privately owned public spaces and giving my recommendations today. So let's see if this is working.
Can we click one more time on the slides, Brendan?
Sure.
All right, now you should.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be going through just a quick project recap to bring us up to speed, and then talking about some of my findings from an assessment of use at the spaces since last time we focused on the regulations. And then spending the majority of our time talking about the management systems of POPs and the recommendations. And so, next slide, please. So privately owned public spaces, as we've already talked about, are an incentive program run by the Department of City Planning, where private developers get extra floor area in exchange for building a public space and being responsible for the cost of that. And so it's seen as a win-win because the city and the public get this public space without the cost of it, and then private owners get additional revenue from the floor area. But it hasn't really been an equal win-win in the past, especially because of poor enforcement of violations of the program, poor designs of spaces, and then poor management of the spaces. And so next slide, please.
Brendan, can we remove Mark's photo or minimize it, please?
And of course, it's important in this district because there are 80 POPs.
Sorry, Mark. Ah, there you go. Okay.
There are 80 POPs in the area, so they just really shape the open space here.
We have a fifth of the POPs in the entire city.
Yes.
Wow, that's a lot.
Next slide. And so context for me being here, I'm a graduate student as well as a fellow with the Fund for the City of New York. And so that's why I'm working with Community Board 6 on this project. And next slide. And so I'm looking into how can the board motivate building owners to improve their privately owned public spaces. Particularly, we talked about renovation last time, but I'll be focusing both on renovation, just larger issues with the program as we talk about it today. And partially the motivator for that is that the board has looked at violations in the past, assessing violations at sites and reporting them and opening up access. But we wanted to talk about moving into a space of advocating for changes rather than just responding to violations at sites. And so next slide. And so last time we ended with with the findings from the case study sites
that the motivations for renovations at these sites were not primarily for the sake of public space. There were for other motivators for these buildings, for rebranding and redoing their interior lobby and their outdoor space, as well as requesting reduced hours of access, which kind of forced them into updating their space as well. And so while these building owners may care about creating a nice public space, their like primary motivators are financial because they're responsible to their investors or to their tenants. And so just creates a slight mismatch in motivations. And so that's important to note as we think about how we can motivate them to create better public spaces. And next slide. And then the other piece that we ended on was just that the process right now doesn't focus enough on who's expected to use the space and kind of engaging in community involvement in assessing what use might look like and connecting what they are building with how they want the space to be used. And so that will take me in today to talking about observations about use at these spaces that have been made through being on site, talking with community board members, talking with the DCP POPs team, and other community organizations. Next slide. And so I will be talking about how are these spaces serving community members today. Next slide. So first off, the first case study site is 783rd Avenue. We looked at this site before. It's an urban plaza. And this image looks really lovely. It was redone in 2022. And you can see here, there's lots of office workers probably having coffee down here. But the thing is that the program historically is really focused on office workers and this type of use. But we know that there are a lot of other people in this district. And so while I was spending time here, next slide, please. I was seeing delivery workers who use this area to take a rest in the mornings and to get some breakfast. And then next slide. I was also seeing protesters using the space in front of this building. And next slide. And so I also, these NYPD barricades have been left up in front of the building for about a month while I was observing it in the winter because of the protests that were ongoing in front of the building, because it's the headquarters for the New York State Senators. And then next slide. But the thing is that these barricades, I kind of reduced access to the public space in this area because, next slide, they are where all of these red barriers are. And so like not only did they reduce access to the front of the building, but they also kind of encroached on that space around the plaza on the southern side of the building. And then the other case study site, 285 Lexington Avenue, which, thank you, which is this deep arcade space. I know it's come before the board, so you're familiar with the fact that they're asking for reduced hours of access because
is this your photo?
There. Yes, it is.
This is very bleak.
Fairly accurate.
Yes. And I know through like their request, there's lots of documented issues with the use at night, but it also just begs the question more generally of public space, and especially people who don't have private spaces aren't allowed to be in public space, then where are they allowed to be? And so next slide. And so lastly, just of my time spent on these sites, I'll end with these rules of conduct signs, which I saw at these two sites as well as several others in the district. And they just have these long lists of things that people cannot do in this public space. And starts to make you think about like, is this a public space? What are these public spaces meant to be used for? And currently the DCP doesn't have any review of these signs. They just have a couple of rules about what should or shouldn't be included, and that there should only be one sign per site. But practically speaking, private owners can put whatever they want on there because there is no review of them. And next slide. And so kind of all of these different case studies and looking further into this, I put all this information into these booklets that I have here with me today. And I shared with Brendan a few hours ago, but I know that's not enough time for people to actually look at them. But so I'll let people look at those afterwards to get kind of further into detail in some of these different user groups that I was looking at and how they interact with POPs. But looking towards recommendations, next slide, I wanted to talk about how the current system works, who has influence here, so we can think about what the board can do to advocate for better spaces. So next slide. So the current system right now, one of the major enforcement mechanisms is fines, but the average violation fine is only about $5,000, and that can be issued several times a year, but that depends on how often things are reported and the DOB's capacity to go and review these sites. And that really pales in comparison to the amount of revenue that these buildings could be making annually. Could you click one more time?
Sorry, the violations, are these just solely for not keeping within the terms of the POPs or?
Yes, that's correct. So they're reactive and only based on kind of really specific built environment violations.
Okay.
And so just as an illustrative point for 780 Third Avenue with the bonus floor area that they got and kind of the average commercial rents in Midtown right now, they could be making over $5 million annually just in bonus floor area space. So these $5,000 fines are really not a big motivator for them to change the way that they're managing these spaces, or at the very least, making sure that they're open during the day. There's one or two sites that are kind of always closed during the day. And so then next slide. And so here, I'm just going to break down some of the major players that are involved in the POP system. So we have the Department of City Planning and Department of Buildings, where a lot of previous efforts have been focused. But I think that working with several other stakeholders can go towards working not just of changing the rules, but changing potentially the culture of how these spaces are approached. So that's looking at land use lawyers who have a lot of power between building owners and the Department of City Planning, because they are the liaison between those two entities. And they have a lot of knowledge about the POP space and kind of control that knowledge flow.
Right.
Next. And then there's also the building architects and the public space architects who determine how the space is built, and that legacy will last for several decades. And next. And then, of course, we have the community board and other community organizations who can speak on behalf of the community. And then next, this is the last one. But then we have all of these other people, and especially these people down on the bottom in pink, who are just kind of some of the different user groups that I identified who might be using POPs in the district. And you can see that there are very many of them, but they're pretty disconnected from these players at the top here. And in this graph, you put one more time. There we go. I've kind of listed them on who has the most power in this relationship and who has the least power. And so all of these people who could be using this site and might actually be spending time there have the least power and least say in how it's actually managed and developed. And so this brings me into talking about the recommendations today. And this quote from one of the studies that I was looking at that I found to be perfect framing for this, just that New York's public life is not spontaneous. It is bound by regulation and codes of conduct. These codes and regulations not only control what can happen on the streets and sidewalks, plazas and parks, but also can be present there. In other words, who constitutes New York's public? Okay, next slide. And so my recommendations are really built around engagement, assessment, and advocacy in these spaces. Next slide. And so I've bucketed them into three major categories, the first one being local public groups. And so with kind of three suggestions first of identifying local public user groups and making a plan for ongoing engagement with them. I know that the community board already does this to some capacity with certain groups, but for instance, like with delivery workers, I don't know if there's anyone that's specifically in touch with kind of that group of people that's forming with over 600,000 delivery workers working in New York City right now. And I know that they are unionizing as well and understanding their needs. And then with that ongoing engagement, which I think will serve the board in many other ways, conducting a public space needs assessment, which kind of would function very similarly to the district statement needs, of just being able to articulate what those needs are per user group and being able to take that information and move into advocacy mode with that. And so moving on to the next set of recommendations with both private partners and government partners. I know there's a lot of text here, but the high level takeaway is that with this local public groups work, it unlocks a lot of the advocacy efforts with private partners and with government partners, because then the board is able to articulate how public space may not be serving certain groups, especially if that can be mapped to areas of the district. Because what I heard from one architect that I got feedback from was saying that when they're designing for these spaces, they don't know everything that's happening in the district, and they don't really have a way to find out, like, when we're designing this specific site, what the needs are around that area. And so that support for that would be helpful. And so I think that's my major recommendation, and then pretty much calling out all these other partners that there could be more outreach and advocacy with, and things like with public space architects, just when it comes to that renovation process, like developing a preferred list of architects who work well with communities and kind of involve them in their process might be one idea for kind of having something really tangible and easy to put together. And that's the end of this presentation today. And I'd just like to say thank you to all of you and all of your help on this and feedback throughout the process. There's still a few things that I'm going to be finishing up afterwards, like these booklets that I brought today. There's just a little bit of finishing that I want to do. So this is a version that I brought today. And then I'll pause there for comments and questions on the recommendations.
Thank you.
I have a question, a comment, a doubt, concern. I don't know how to describe. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, of course.
So I don't, with the situation in the city now, I don't know, the public space is not really public anymore, and that's a concern, and I don't really know how to, you cannot control if it's public, you cannot really control who is gonna go there and how it's gonna be used. Even the architect or anybody can control. So it's a place for homeless, it's a place for the delivery people. Like the delivery people, for example, they don't have a place to wait, even to go to the bathroom. They're trying, it's, so how do we address the unknown or this situation?
Well, I was just gonna say, what I think I heard was better understanding of what those needs are, like codifying if they're delivery persons that are in the district that need a place to go to the bathroom or park their bikes, providing more of a resource for that. To support those needs, as opposed to just building benches and planters and saying, yep, we're done. It doesn't really fit a need, it covers it's a space.
Right, that would be, I think that would be its own public space, or its own space for delivery workers.
Yeah, or a section.
There's a whole group of amenities that they would need.
Yeah, I really like the idea of the best practices, that we can have a conversation when we do have the attorneys that represent the owners or the architects. I'm a little wary of having a recommended list of architects.
Yeah,
right.
Seems like it's, like we're driving folks to a certain person, but
Especially for public.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
But that being said, I think we absolutely could put together some of the use cases, get to know them a little bit better, and then circulate them or talk about them, right?
There is a precedent with the sheds, the restaurant sheds. There is a precedent that you have to join a list and pass through a series of evaluations to become part of the vendors or the architects that can assist the customers towards that. So,
Like a vetting process.
it's more like a vendor, qualified, it's pre-qualified. So they are creating this,
But the city, the cities.
the city is organizing it. So if you email me, I can send you the contact information. So you can look at it, because that's a way of having the list of architects, but it's not by the city, it's by choice. You enroll, you have to have the insurance requirements, and you have to go through a series of lectures and preparation. Like, you cannot just sign, you have to understand.
That seems like a good way to approach it.
Yeah, Missy, thank you so much for this. One of the takeaways that just jumped out at me, when we really just measure the violation, 5K, compared to annual income of upwards of 5 million. I don't know if my math is right, but this is like 0.0. It's like a cent on the $100. Fine. So that that I think goes more into advocacy. How can we advocate for, first, more resources for enforcement to action, but if you're charged one time, obviously you'll do it. But if you're charged 100 times a year, maybe you'll start to think about, okay, this violation is actually expensive. And the other side to say, review of these laws. We don't have a lot of new POPs being built. That if you really, the graph just slowed down to a halt. No POPs are being built right now. But part of it is also reviewing the laws that could incentivize developers with so much new construction happening. And again, a lot of construction in our district, massive developments, billions of dollars in new development. No POPs, no agreements are even on the list. So revising the laws to make it incentivizing, and I think this is an opportunity that, again, we need to talk to our elected officials, try to.
Well, it can be connected to the square footage they are being able to build.
Right.
So per amount of square footage, you have to pay X amount of dollars for maintaining the pods or for, so the fine is 50,000, 100,000, so they, make sure that.
Right. Go there.
I just saw, for the first time in years, the the escalators at Union Square in front of the new Target store, both operating.
Well, those Eckendorf ones, yeah.
Yes, and there's an example of an operating agreement to operate privately owned public space. And there needing to be, in this case, it's the MTA leaning on these folks. And finally, maybe it was also the store owner also influencing them that got it to be fixed. So finding where those pressure points are, and it may well have been Target that did the magic.
Right.
And it's not just fines, but it's finding folks who can provide incentive to improve it, not only for the public, but for their own private
the
benefit.
business.
If there's a commercial operation anywhere involved with it, you generally see a better result.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, if they crowdsource enforcement by saying if you see it closed, snap a photo and submit it to the city, like they attempted to do for violators parking in a bike lane. And I know they had to stop a bunch of these because they were creating conflict. But whatever, you can support the city with very little DCP with its limited resources.
No, we become part of the solution,
Right.
We help. I agree with that.
So you could have snapped a photo on the way here, saying that
I.
in a future program.
What is that side that you're saying, the escalators, Larry?
This is at Union Square, on
Southeast.
Second North Tower, between Third and Fourth Avenue.
Uh-huh.
All right, go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I was gonna say, it seems to be a pretty successful program now for the idling of commercial vehicles.
Right.
So it's something similar, people could be joining and helping, generate the fines, which is income for the city and without having to pay for the people to go around and enforce it.
I think there's something we need to discuss more and see if we, in future times, maybe put a resolution, take it to our elected officials. And
Yeah,
And I'll
definitely.
say just I talked with the DCP POPs team, but I didn't have an opportunity to get in touch with Department of Buildings. So I think that was on the recommendations list to invite them to a meeting to talk more about their role, because they're the ones that are really in charge of the fines, of reviewing and enforcing them. So I think further contact with them would really help. Help the board understand what the challenges are there and what would be useful to the Department of Buildings.
Got it. Okay, I'll link them public.
That's a great segue, because I was gonna ask about how city planning plays, and is involved in POPs. Did you take a look at perhaps the design standards that city planning describes? As architects will tell you, they're very limited in the things that they can do outside of the zoning resolution. So a lot of the changes that you advocated for and shown here can be changes that city planning can take, so that way architects could have more leeway to design POPs that would be better suited for neighborhoods and residents.
Yeah, I think, so I talked with the POPs team, which is only 2 people. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but so, speaking of limited capacity, it's very limited capacity. And so I think that having specific needs for the district would be really helpful for them, because they just don't know all that detail. And so I did look at the current zoning resolutions are very specific about what needs to be built there. And so that's why I started to think about or focus on what is the use happening, because that seems to be some of the gap. And I know the zoning resolution is supposed to be about more of the built environment. But it just feels like there's a link missing between, as we try and constantly update these rules to kind of get private owners to have the right incentives and right intent. It just doesn't match what the culture is and what their primary motivators are. I do know that the POPs team that I talked to them, I think they're considering adjustments to the POPs program. So this would be a great time to come to them with suggestions and with different insights about what's happening in the district and how things could be improved.
Yeah, it's about programming, you
Yeah.
know, it's about programming each pop according to what you said, you know, depending on the needs, it's a program, it's not about city planning rules, you know?
Yeah.
I
And
think
another
that's the missing link.
Another thing I was thinking about this morning too is, I know the Brooklyn Borough President, he in the past year created a comprehensive plan for Brooklyn and is trying to advocate for that to be incorporated into the rest of the city. And I think that's something else that I was seeing with POPs of, even with the zoning resolution, you have all these rules that applies to when each person individually makes the space, but there's not kind of like an overall plan or overall consideration of like what the needs might be in this area or within these few blocks. Like maybe we have a few POPs that are already providing this type of seating. Do we need a POPs that needs to have something else there?
Go ahead, Larry, then public comment.
One of the things that we discussed was there being concessions, like for food, for people who are sitting down and urging people to linger.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
stimulate business.
I was gonna say, I think one of the photos that you showed a food truck,
Yes.
which was not in existence when that POPs was originally created, right? I mean, concept.
Yeah,
So it's a use that's evolved.
And it's interesting that food truck has been there, at least looking at Google Street View for at least 10 years. Where it's like the renovations, they redid a cafe in the lobby, and at least from the times I was there, like I barely saw anybody using the cafe in the lobby. And then the cart had like a constant stream of people coming to it, and so that it's more of a neighborhood staple.
Right.
Than what's being built in the building.
But not considered.
Yeah, but
Right.
I don't think they're considered as part of it.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
Just for the, I'll say a couple of comments. One, I really like the idea on the engagement side for the assessment. Because like as was mentioned, the food trucks kind of navigate there towards the thing that should show us that that's what the area is being used for those hours. A couple of things I also want to mention for the idea of it is, one, the standards, I guess, like that Third Avenue public space is very dark at night. If you're walking across town, you know, it's kind of something that you avoid just because you know it's a little bit darker than the next street. Even lighting standards for nighttime, you know, there's a lot of engagement that can occur in with the PPP, with the public and the private elements, or at least covering them. And then the last comment was that we have such a great summer that, you know, and we have so many of the public space of the POPs in our area that engaging in some sort of events or, you know, summer streets, or, you know, these can be landing pads for a lot of.
For food festival, yes.
It's an activation of it.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Having some sort of governance in that for our summer programs can be a start. But the lighting at nighttime is definitely something that can help.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Anne, you had a comment?
Be unmute. You should be able to speak now, Anne.
Hi, thanks for that. Yeah, and thanks for all your work on this. POPs are so frustrating. Because once they're built, essentially the owners have no incentive to do anything because they've already got what they want. The two POPs closest to me, one of them has been closed for several years because they're doing construction. It had been also closed for a couple of years during COVID. I called multiple times. They eventually got hit with a $25,000 fine and were open the next day.
Hey,
It's still
there you
open.
go.
But you know what? But they were open for like a year and now, you know, they're doing construction. And as far as I can tell, both there and the Dock Commercial, like half of Dock Commercial is closed. And that's for construction. And as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know, and hopefully you can give a more knowledgeable answer, once, you know, if it's closed for construction, it's basically a free pass. Like forever.
I think that would definitely be a good opportunity area for conversation with Department of Buildings and where some of my knowledge is lacking. Because on exactly what you're saying of it's this mix of like, okay, fines can get owners to open up their space, but then if they're an owner that's just hostile to this being public space, they're probably going to find another way to close it off eventually. And I know that
I mean, the CB6 staff will tell you like how many phone calls it took, right, guys?
Yes. It was an effort.
And right now, DOB has gone and said it's legitimate closure. Okay. Because
So-
they're using.
The other thing I was wondering, were you aware that we had done sort of a POPs inventory a few years ago? And like, I hope you were able to build on that and update it so we have that going forward.
Yeah, I think the biggest piece of what I did was look at, since there've been a few previous inventories, what I really wanted to focus was on more of these qualitative pieces about use and about, especially what I looked into was management practices, because all the focus has been on built environment and how much seating is required, but that there are these management practices, like putting up these rules, or like you're saying, even just like closing these spaces, or even having security guards that discourage use, that make the space hostile.
And I think that's what our last inventory was. It was like, okay, here's a POPs. What's the status? What's going on? And it would be great to have that updated. We did that on a crowdsourcing basis, but I just would hope that information doesn't get lost.
Yes, and I'll provide a resource kind of in the wrap up materials from this, but the Advocates for POPs website, APOPs, does have kind of all of POPs in the city, and they have crowdsourced. They have a crowdsourcing mechanism, so people can write comments and put in what's happening at the sites. It's not a perfect system, but I think it is kind of one good resource that's already set up to track some of that information, so it can stay in one place and not duplicate all of the effort of building that.
And you can put in a POPs complaint on 311, like on the app.
Yes.
So.
Okay, with that, thank you so much, Missy. This is really great. I'm just this is amazing.
It is great. Thank you.
Yeah, really appreciate all the work. We will circulate, yes, Brendan, the materials we got to the full group.
As one final comment, can I just say I went to your school presentation and I met your parents and they were absolutely lovely.
Yes, and thank you. Thank you at the end.
Great. Please have this in the record. Okay. With that, I'm waiving my report. Just a reminder, our next meeting is June 24th. This was our longest meeting this year, so promise next time we'll try to make it even faster. Okay, any old or new business for anybody else?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Meeting is adjourned at 8:36. Thank you, folks. Online. Thank you, Mark.